and welcome to RELEX Talks, where on the second Wednesday of every month, we'll share a variety of topics that we help to inform and inspire. Today, our topic is all things wholesale, and I have with me Patrick O'Mara. Patrick, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good to see you, Rachel. Patrick O'Mara. I'm a senior solution principal with RELEX Solutions. Been with RELEX for about a little over 4 years now, with a focus in really helping retailers, wholesalers, understand their challenges, and then help position and partner RELEX Solutions with those challenges. I have a real large interest in convenience, grocery, and then the wholesalers that supply them. I think it's just a fascinating space.
Great. Thanks for joining us today. And I'm Rachel Dutton. I've been with RELEX 6 years. I'm an account executive, and like Patrick, I've helped people learn more about RELEX and help solve some of their challenges. So, all right, well, let's go ahead and get started. How about you tell me what makes wholesale so interesting, Patrick?
I mean, why isn't it interesting, really? It's a fascinating space where you've got really complex relationships. So, dealing with both the traditional space of a CPG company selling into a buyer, as well as then turning around and being a supplier to ultimately a seller. So having that many-to-many relationship creates a complex network that has really unique relationships developing, as well as unique challenges coming up. I think that's probably the biggest key, and that probably enables everything else that I'm really interested in. Specifically, the constant churn of new suppliers coming on the market. If a wholesaler is sitting on the same supplier group, the same CPG group, the same product set that they're selling, their consumers, their retailers themselves are going to start to get stale, and ultimately will get passed up. So there's a constant churn of new products being tested, entered into markets, and finally figuring out if they're going to work. So it's really a test bed, I feel like, for every retail product that you and I would buy on the shelves. Third, there's a variety of different formats that they're going to. So some wholesalers may focus on convenience stores, where you're hyper-focused on providing products that are going to be about quick, easy, grab and go type products. Whereas, some wholesalers may be focusing on grocery, where it's all about, hyper fresh, or perhaps discount, where you're looking at trying to provide products at a fair price to consumers, especially in this inflationary format. So those different formats provide a kaleidoscope of different opportunities to go after and different challenges, which I think is just fascinating. And then to kind of turn it, some of the challenges that I see specific that are really interesting are lack of communication. So oftentimes when we have conversations with wholesalers, there's a huge conversation around lack of communication between that many-to-many relationship. So the CPGs might not be providing enough information ahead of time on new products being introduced, new offerings, or products that are being terminated, or lack of inventory. As well as on the other side, you see retail partners who might be opening or closing stores and aren't communicating that at all until that event occurs. There's very little communication on how they're going to be ordering, as well as a huge conversation around promotions and which promotions your customers, those retailers, are going to take, as well as which ones they're going to pass on. Maybe this wholesaler is doing pre-booking, which is a fascinating way of communicating and working with their retail partners. But ultimately, what I've seen holistically in that space is that there's a major opportunity for communication. And then tying directly to that, I think there's a fascinating opportunity around network design related to inventory, to ensure that you've got the right product in the right area of the country to best support that individual customer base. So I think that ties directly back to that. What formats is that particular wholesaler working with? Are they focusing on hyper fresh? Are they focusing on convenience? Are they trying to do it all? And especially if that wholesaler is working with multiple different formats, being able to load the inventory in the right area of the country to support the downstream retailers who are going to be buying is absolutely critical to be successful in a really tight margin business.
That makes sense. It sounds like that many to many relationship kind of drives a lot of challenges from, network design. Where do you best position your distribution centers to shorten lead times from your suppliers to all of your retail partners, as well as you mentioned new products. We know, assortment is a hot topic right now among retailers, and that also reflects, it seems, on the wholesale side. How do you get your assortment right within each of your store formats? Which products should be introduced? How do you measure how they're doing? And how do you communicate that both downstream and upstream from the wholesale perspective? So you talked a lot about communication. When you think of communication between all of those parties, what are some of the things that wholesalers could think about doing to kind of improve that?
Absolutely. I think a couple different things they could do to really make great strides there is strengthening vendor partner relationships through more data integration. So thinking through like vendor portals or collaborative environments where a supplier and that wholesaler can share information. Oftentimes this is kind of construed as a one-way relationship where the CPG, the supplier, is expected to just provide data. And if it's not a truly collaborative environment, nobody is incented to actually make that successful. So being able to provide that environment where, perhaps the CPG company is providing their trade funds automatically through the portal. They're providing any pricing changing, any new items. But then the wholesaler is turning around and providing data back, things around product performance, where they see general forecast is a great example. It's probably the easiest starting point is sharing those forecasts back, but then being able to even dive in and help those suppliers be more prescriptive with where they're spending time by using exception-based management on that side to provide views into where that supplier has a new item that might be ramping up or a new item that's not performing very well. So that way the supplier and the the supplier and the wholesaler company can work together to ultimately achieve the objectives that they set out by putting that item into the assortment. Then on the other side, I think there's a huge communication opportunity when it comes to the store partners, whether they be a wholesale single buyer where they're operating a single store in mid-America perhaps, or whether they're operating an operator of 100 stores and buying from that wholesaler. There's a big opportunity of communication there, and generally that can work in the form of sharing raw sales data, which is, I know, an interesting topic that sometimes can cause challenge. Obviously scrubbed for any loyalty or consumer data, so that way we're being very careful with security. But being able to share that data as a first and foremost, but then being able to turn around and offer services back to that retailer to create that collaborative environment. And those services could look like creating computer-assisted ordering, making recommendations to those stores, as opposed to the stores just sending the orders up. That creates a better flow of data as well as flow of inventory, as the wholesaler can then prepare for that inventory to be coming out through projections.
Those are great ideas, Patrick. So it sounds, you're welcome. It sounds kind of like there's a lot of opportunities for data sharing and visibility, especially into the factors like pricing, promotions, assortment, that are really driving that demand and the changes in the amount of inventory that needs to be available. Speaking of inventory, are you seeing any challenges in wholesale around inventory scarcity in the current environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the recovery from COVID has been long. It's been hard. It certainly peaked up where we're seeing less vendor out of stocks, but that is still something that is a common complaint challenge that we hear on a regular basis. And the bad thing about that is that a supplier out of stock is reflected extremely poorly on the wholesaler, because ultimately the retailer is looking at their competitors on the shelves, and if they're using an alternative wholesaler or direct sourcing, and they see that product available elsewhere in the market, it reflects right back on the wholesaler. So it's really important to be as clinical as possible. And this is another great example of communication. Where there are out of stocks, making sure that that's communicated, and when you expect to have that back in stock is a great example, tying back to that communication point. But then also, again, the collaboration going upstream to make sure that you're sharing as a wholesaler your projections, what your need is going forward, so you're getting your fair share. So that way, it's not all going to the direct suppliers, direct sourcing, and that the wholesaler gets their opportunity to procure those key items that are on a scarcity, currently in a scarcity situation.
That's totally true. And also, it seems like it'd be important to have, a data connection with substitutable products. So when you think of we're out here, that's going to spike these other products, to be able to capture that relationship and be able to perhaps automatically order some of those other products or have them more available.
Well, and making sure you tie, when you're doing those substitutability, making sure you're tying that to, for example, if there's a promotion ongoing, that if you're substituting a product, that it's going to be applicable for the promotion. So either within the same trade funds bucket, or recognizing that item that is that can be substituted for your turn sales business. So that way it's a win-win for the supplier. They are still participating in the upside while you are still giving some service to your downstream customers. So recognizing when substitutability is appropriate, and then identifying that how can we make this successful for both the retailer who's selling the product, as well as the supplier who's ultimately responsible and needs to get back in stock of the core product.
Right. That's super true. You make some great points, Patrick. So when you think of wholesale, what are some of the other challenges we're seeing today? Anything on the labor side, or what are you kind of seeing in the market?
Yes, I'll start just probably tying back into the conversation we just had. Is margin is a huge issue. Wholesale has always been a margin business, a compressed space where it's important to make sure that you are buying and selling at the right price, you are applying your labor at the right price, and you're managing your transportation appropriately. And we see that as a constant in our conversations, specifically around how do I better plan the flow of inventory to alleviate around those different pressure points. Now, with that specifically, and tying back in, ensuring that your promotions are properly aligned with both your vendor funding and your actual demand is, I think, a critical issue we're seeing in wholesale right now, especially as inflation continues to creep up. So both from a cost standpoint, while we started to see at retail the inflation start to taper, the costs on the back end have not tapered as much, which means that pressure or that margin is being compressed even more. That, I think, dovetails really tightly in with labor, where labor is still a major constraint, as we're still at a extremely low unemployment, especially when it comes to running, a factory or a distribution center. Specifically, distribution centers are very challenging when you see convenience retailers offering $20 an hour, or even call centers offering $20 an hour. It's hard to get somebody to work in a distribution facility for $17 an hour. So recognizing the trends compacting on labor and being able to design around that is incredibly important. We've seen a ton of investment in robotics. We've seen a ton of investment in automation as you go in that direction, but then also understanding how does that tie in with your inventory flow? How does that tie in with your peak seasons, ensuring that you're really able to mitigate the risks that come when you do have those labor shortage periods. A great example was talking with a wholesaler relatively recently, and they had a major issue with they were concerned about their team making going far in the NFL playoffs. They were particularly concerned because they knew every time their team advanced, that they were going to have major call outs one day a week. How do they better mitigate that situation so they can be happy when their team goes farther in the playoffs, as opposed to being scared that they're going to be having to call in a bunch of overtime and paying extra for that? So better flowing inventory around those key events is a great example of way to better balance that labor constraint that we see occurring in the wholesale space.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Because of course, if you don't have the labor available, then you can't move the inventory. So
Exactly. How do you get it down to how do you get it in the consumer's hands if you don't have the people to pick, pack, and ship?
Right. Important jobs.
I think if I could point out one more, Rachel, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that, the final big constraint I see in the wholesale industry is a severe lack of investment to technology. So, I mentioned there's been investment in things like automation, and I think that's an area where operators have gotten ahead of it and are looking for ways to be more efficient in moving their products through their network. But I think there's a significant lack of investment historically in core merchandising systems. So master data, pricing, promotion, as well as in purchase order, kind of cash to cash lifecycle products. So thinking forecasting, replenishment, ordering, and then ultimately the PO management as well. So there's been a lack of investment in that space that's ultimately put wholesalers in a position where they just don't have a platform to take advantage of true AI and ML as they kind of look to advance into the current buzzwords of retail and wholesale technology.
Right. It wouldn't be a tech talk if we didn't talk about AI and ML. I guess, what are some of the uses if they do make this foundational investment? You have the foundation of master data. What are some of the uses you could see from the planning perspective of AI and ML to help with some of those challenges that you mentioned earlier?
Sure. I mean, the biggest areas are going to be granularity. So being able to get extremely granular down to within a channel, and maybe we'll come back to that in just a second. But being able to be extremely granular and then to use different data sets that have been traditionally available are huge opportunities. So as you look at things like the traditional data sets, you're looking at, what am I selling it for? How many did I sell? On what day did I sell? Does this product have seasonality? Kind of the basics. Whereas when you start to use artificial intelligence, machine learning, you can bring in a lot more localization. So looking at, potentially things like regionalized events that might drive a significant change on a segment of your business. Looking at how price indexes or inflation nationally could impact your overall business or regionality of your business. Then looking at things like, potentially looking at like health trends. So a few years ago, if you had the COVID rates, that most likely had a high correlation with certain products being purchased. So recognizing those unstructured trends and being able to apply those is a key tenet of machine learning and AI, but it's only available if you have that core data. I think the more attainable, call it easier to check box, would be that channel level forecasting. So getting more granular and being able to plan at a better level. So I think wholesale has evolved from having this demand planner runs a line of the business where they're just trying to look at aggregate trends and then apply a demand curve against those. Where we see more folks getting involved are things like key account managers or demand planners who have a specialty in a specific region or a very specific product line, and being able to get more specific as well as more automated at a more granular level allows for a higher degree of accuracy, especially when catching trends and holding service levels for specific groups. So I think that's really important in this space specifically, is being able to track and forecast at that. So for example, a key customer by region can allow you then to also ensure that you have a higher service level at a lower cost for that specific customer. And where that's going to be really important is going to be when we start bundling up those customers as well. So oftentimes we think of a channel and we might think of, I'll just throw somebody out like a Walmart. If I'm selling to Walmart, that's a channel. I have a dedicated account manager, and I want to be able to forecast for them. But if I also want to, consider a bunch of mom and pops, it doesn't make sense for me to forecast for Pat's Grocery and for Rachel's convenience store. So what I can do is I can group those together in a region or based on a price zone or based on promotion offering and be able to use that so I can forecast at a more granular level without getting far too granular. So having that flexible approach, can really help drive the utilization of an AI and ML forecast to its highest efficiency. And then we can start to bring in some of those other external factors, what we call regressors, to bring in to understand how do they impact the planning and forecast for that specific channel.
That's pretty neat stuff, Patrick. It sounds like the more granular you can get, also the easier it would be to collaborate, right? So when you're thinking of the forecast, as well as when you're looking upstream, if you have that more granular information, you have a better view of the demand, and that allows you to then make better ordering decisions from the supplier perspective, but also speak with your retailers and kind of come to a consensus, perhaps, to some of the points that you mentioned earlier. So that's a pretty cool concept. So when you think of, we talked earlier about seasonal peaks and some of the constraints around labor. Is there anything AI ML can help with there that you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. That's I think a great example is that example I laid out of the NFL games and balancing around your labor there. If you know that there will be a game even a week out, being able to better flow product in can do a couple things. First, it can better flow your inventory so it arrives when you have labor. But then it can also allow you to forecast based on the overall demand for both your inbound and outbound shipments. So recognizing the need for that inventory flow is going to be boxed in around a constraint. And that constraint could be the number of hours you have to pick. That could be based on the number of trucks you can receive on a given day. But whatever constraint you end up taking, being able to understand and keep you under that constraint and move that inbound shipment or outbound shipment forward to better meet those constraints can allow you to de-risk your business first and foremost, but then second, help you plan for that workload forecasting to ensure that if you do need to bring in overtime, you are bringing the right amount of overtime. So you're not just, the classic hitting an ant with the hammer. You're finding what is the right size tool to solve the problem, which is a huge opportunity in the wholesale business, especially when you're operating multiple distribution centers and trying to balance what is that workload need across those.
I see. That makes sense. If you can kind of use all of that inventory information, not only to balance, but then you mentioned workload forecasting, which is a pretty cool concept where you can look at that task level and see where we might need to allocate resources, to your point. So thanks, Patrick. That was a good point.
It's one of my favorite topics of things we do is getting to talk around those specific challenges where, it was that NFL example, but it's oftentimes seasonality driven, right? We're coming up on Mother's Day is another great example where especially seasonal candies need to already be in the hands of retailers because we're in the peak selling week for that. So how do you get it into your distribution center in time to get it out to retail that's going to drive your best margin to ensure that your labor is tied with your supply chain movement, and ensuring that ultimately you've got a high service level to your customers who are buying from you.
Definitely. And also a great reminder about Mother's Day coming up for everyone.
Great reminder.
Great. So I guess do you have any kind of 3 key things that wholesalers should think about or advice as we kind of think about the challenges and everything that we talked about so far?
So I've got way more than 3, but I'll try to limit it. So first is absolutely to evaluate. Every person who watches this should immediately go take a look at what tools they're using to solve their problems, and will that help them be margin positive in the next 5 years. So look at the master data stack. Is it in a place where you're able to drive the collaboration? Because if you don't have that platform in place, then how can you take advantage of the things like machine learning and AI that you want to take advantage of next? So that's probably first. Second is examine your collaborative partnerships. You might be engaging with your partners either downstream or upstream today, but are you truly collaborating with them, or are you dictating, or are you being dictated to? So creating a more healthy relationship between both your upstream and your downstream is critical. And that's going to look a little different for everybody, especially based on your relationship with your upstream and your downstream, as far as where you are from a size standpoint, where you are from where your customer is from a size standpoint. But finding the best way to make those relationships work is crucial for the next 5 years in wholesale, as this continues to be an exceptionally competitive space. And then third is, once you have that foundation in place, how do you practically apply AI and ML to your business? As you mentioned, Rachel, there's if you can't go to NRF or to any type of trade show without seeing everybody post AI and ML. But how is it really practical? How can we really use it in this particular space? I think wholesalers, as their third area of focus, should spend their time looking at what is practical for me now, what is practical for me in 5 years, because there's a phase gate to walk through. There's steps to walk up to really take advantage of that. And there's opportunities we can do now, but there's also opportunities down the road that if we're setting the right foundation, wholesalers can really help themselves.
Those are great points. And to your last point too, it's what's practical, but also what drives the most value and what's solving problems, right?
Absolutely.
Not applying hammer to ant, what you mentioned earlier, but really looking at the problems you're trying to solve and where you want to drive value. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the conversation today, Patrick, and thanks to everyone tuning in. See, Nadine's made a few comments. Dale, thank you for joining. Thank you to everyone else. So, all right.